Hello, I'm John Spritzler. I'm a member of People for Democratic Revolution in Boston, pdrboston.org, and I would like to talk a little bit about this whole question of voting for your favorite candidate for president. It's a little bit newsworthy, even though we're not in the election cycle yet, because Senator Elizabeth Warren, the darling of liberals, has there's been speculation that she might run for president or run for vice president on Hillary Clinton's ticket. Also, Senator Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, has announced that he's considering running for president, depending on what other people do or don't do. So these two darlings of the left and the liberal demographic are in the news in connection with the presidential election. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think we should not vote for either of these two people, or anyone else for that matter, in the presidential election. But I'll focus a little bit on Elizabeth Warren. So first of all, let me just say something about this lesser evil idea that is the reason why people tend to vote for whoever they vote for, even though there's a lot of negative things that could be said about the person. Voting for lesser evil is impossible if there is no lesser evil to vote for. So let's take a little trip down memory lane. This was the case historically. Anti-war candidates such as FDR, LBJ, and Nixon, with his secret plan to end the Vietnam War, turned out to be pro-war candidates, if you look at the history. If there were really a pro-war candidate running against an anti-war candidate, then a person who was opposed to the war in question and felt this single issue was more important than any other issue could vote for the anti-war candidate as a lesser evil. But when even the, quote, anti-war candidate is really pro-war, as historically it's always turned out to be the case, it's impossible to vote for the lesser evil. There is no lesser evil to vote for. Voting for the lesser evil is also impossible if one has no clue from campaign promises what a candidate will actually do if elected. How then can one possibly know which candidate is the lesser evil? Those who voted for Truman and Eisenhower back then did not know they were voting for a man who would commit mass murder with nuclear weapons for a purpose that he refused to divulge, as is the case with Truman and dropping nuclear bombs on Japan, supposedly because it was necessary to save American lives and end the war early. But now it turns out it's not even controversial. It's well known that Truman knew that the Japanese had offered to surrender on only one condition: that the emperor be allowed to remain on the throne. Well, Truman let the emperor remain on the throne, so obviously that wasn't a deal breaker. But Truman wanted to drop those bombs anyway. It had nothing to do with ending the war early, because the Japanese already were surrendering on terms that were acceptable. So he had completely ulterior reasons that he could not divulge to the American public for dropping those nuclear weapons. So those who voted for Truman and Eisenhower did not know they were voting for a man who would commit mass murder with nuclear weapons for a purpose he refused to divulge, or for a case of Eisenhower, for a man who would use rhetoric about defending freedom against communism to support dictators as brutal as any communist, but more conducive to U.S. corporate profits, which is exactly what Eisenhower's foreign policy was all about, starting with supporting the dictatorships in Greece and continuing. Liberals who voted for what they believed was a liberal President Bill Clinton got cuts in the social safety net, ending welfare as we know it, famously, and they got the NAFTA attack on workers, shipping jobs overseas to Mexico and so forth if you tried to get better working conditions or benefits. Conservatives who voted for what they believed was a conservative, staunch anti-communist Nixon got an end to the Cold War against communist China. Only Nixon could go to China, remember. And also, they got one of the most liberal presidents domestically in that period of time. It was Nixon, who initiated affirmative action. Jimmy Carter, no doubt, seemed like a lesser evil candidate because he was such a humanitarian guy. How could voters have known that he would execute a foreign policy of backing the most brutal and murderous dictators in the world, in particular in Indonesia, and help them to kill hundreds of thousands of people? Also in Latin America, he did the same thing. Ronald Reagan persuaded many blue-collar former Democratic Party voters to vote for him because he would lower their taxes. Instead, he raised them on that demographic. He lowered them on the rich people. Voters opposed to raising taxes thought George H.W. read my lips, no new taxes Bush was their lesser evil man, but that turned out to be wrong too. He raised taxes. Those who voted for Obama because he was for single-payer health care, as he famously said he was before being elected, or because he supported Palestinian human rights, as he also said in Chicago when he went to meetings of Palestinians, or because he was better on civil liberties than the Republican, or because he was less of a warmonger, well, they found out later that they really hadn't had a clue when they were in the voting booth what they were actually voting for. I mean, for crying out loud, this is a president who abolished habeas corpus and announces that he has a right to kill Americans without any judicial oversight. So much for constitutional liberties and rights. The voters in American presidential elections have never been able to vote for an actual lesser evil, only for a candidate they wrongly thought was a lesser evil. In truth, they voted for complete unknowns. Voting for the candidate one believes to be the lesser evil is a bad idea because that candidate might very well be the one not only willing, they're all willing, but best able to implement evil. The phrase, "only Nixon could go to China," is an important historical lesson. It means that the politician who has a reputation for opposing some policy is precisely the one best able to implement that policy. This is because the leading figures in society who oppose that policy are loath to attack their own guy, even when he implements the hated policy. Thus, only Clinton could end welfare as we know it, or bomb Serbian civilians without liberal leaders so much as saying boo. Only Nixon could initiate affirmative action. Only Obama, the constitutional law professor, could destroy the last vestiges of American constitutional rights. And while Republican G.W. Bush failed to privatize, and hence undermine, Social Security, Democrat Obama may very well succeed. Be afraid, be very afraid of the lesser evil. Well, now let's turn our attention to Elizabeth Warren.
You looking for a article here?
Yeah. There's going to be two articles posted at wherever the articles are posted on YouTube. The bottom line, is that what it's called?
The link.
The link line, the low bar, is that what it's called? Whatever. Okay. So we talked about the general concept of voting for the lesser evil. There is no evidence whatsoever that the plutocracy that actually controls the United States will give up its control because of an election. Just consider what the American plutocracy did when the people of Chile voted in a president opposed to the plutocracy there. They murdered him and established an overt dictatorship of the rich, as the late Nobel laureate Gabriel Garcia Marquez describes in a wonderful article that he wrote at the time that's online that we'll post. Even Senator Warren's promises are bad. First, consider foreign policy. Here is her position on Israel from her own website, which we'll put a link on for that as well. She writes, To me, it is a moral imperative to support and defend Israel, and I am committed to ensuring its long-term security by maintaining its qualitative military edge. Israel must be able to defend itself from the serious threats it faces from terrorist organizations to hostile states, including Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others. I am also a strong proponent of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I believe to be in the interest of Israel and the United States, with a Jewish democratic state of Israel and a state for the Palestinian people, unquote. What does this mean? The Israeli government refuses to allow the millions of Palestinian refugees from what is now called Israel, that part of Palestine called Israel. It refuses to allow them to return to the land inside Israel from which they were violently driven out in 1948 and 1967 by the soon-to-be, in 1948, and actual, in 1967, leaders of Israel, driven out simply because they were not Jewish. Israel refuses to let them return today simply because they are not Jewish. This is ethnic cleansing, pure and simple. Those who support this ethnic cleansing, like Elizabeth Warren so adamantly does, use racist arguments. They claim that all non-Jews are innately and latently, if not overtly, anti-Semitic, and therefore Jews cannot live safely among non-Jews. This is pure BS, racist BS. Some also use this racist argument. They say, quote, the Palestinians left voluntarily, so they forfeit their right to return, unquote. Well, aside from being false historically, this is racist because those who say this would never apply the same logic to, say, themselves or Americans who voluntarily left their country to go on vacation or attend a business conference, would they? The argument, the additional argument that the ethnic cleansers use is that, quote, God gave the land to the Jews, and this argument is too absurd to even dignify with a rebuttal. Many of those who use this Bible argument, by the way, are in fact atheists, as many Israelis, Jewish people are, and don't deny it. The joke is that their opinion amounts to this, quote, God does not exist, and he gave the land to the Jews. Well, Elizabeth Warren is a staunch defender of this ethnic cleansing. Her support for a two-state solution is support for making the ethnic cleansing permanent, with the Palestinian refugees forever barred from returning to their villages inside Israel. Many of them still possess keys to the houses inside Israel that they once lived in. Warren's two-state solution tells the Palestinian refugees to be happy with a tiny little statelet, a Palestinian state, in, at most, 22% of Palestine, which Israel will totally control the way Israel totally controls the Gaza Strip. By the way, 75% of the residents in the Gaza Strip are refugees from what is called Israel. And Israel, of course, nominally has withdrawn from the Gaza Strip, just like it will nominally have withdrawn from the little statelet that might be called the Palestinian state. The Gaza Strip is widely recognized to be the largest outdoor prison in the world, and there's no reason to think it would be different for the little Palestinian state, if ever there was one. Supporting ethnic cleansing is something that racists like the KKK do. Why would any of us want to vote for a politician who does that? Now let's look at Elizabeth Warren's domestic policy statements. Has she ever said that the rich should be removed from power? No. Has she ever said that there should be real equality, meaning no rich and no poor? No. Does she support capitalism? Yes. Does she want an egalitarian society? No. Does she say the problem is class inequality and it should be abolished? No. This makes her a perfect politician from the point of view of the plutocracy that runs the United States. Why? Because all the plutocracy needs to retain and hold on to its power is to make sure that the principle of class inequality is not challenged by a large number of people. It matters not to the plutocracy that a politician defends the principle of class inequality while adopting vote-getting rhetoric about limiting various excesses of class inequality. The plutocracy couldn't care less, for example, that Elizabeth Warren talks about reducing the interest students pay on student loans, or that she calls for more regulation of banks. These are crumbs compared to the fundamental injustice of our class society, in which, to take just one example, people who work or study in order to work later are told they owe money to bankers who don't work. In fact, the plutocracy wants politicians like Warren to use such rhetoric if this is what it takes to persuade people to rely on voting instead of revolution. Let's keep our eye on the prize, an egalitarian society with no class inequality. This is the only kind of society that can prevent the emergence of what has emerged in the United States today, a class of billionaires who oppress the rest in order to protect their wealth, privilege, and power. All that is required for extreme inequality to emerge is that the principle of class inequality has legitimacy. Senator Warren, like all other American politicians, including Bernie Sanders, about whom more in a minute, refuses to call for the abolition of class inequality. What more could the plutocracy ask of her? Now, Senator Bernie Sanders, as I mentioned, announced he's considering a run for president. He calls himself a socialist and never calls for the abolition of class inequality, which makes him a typical socialist, by the way. If you go to his webpage, and I guess we'll have a link to that too, you'll find not a hint of his wanting to abolish class inequality. What you will find is actually the opposite. You'll find this, quote, it says, quote, "That is why Bernie will be showing the Robert Reich documentary, Inequality for All, as part of a first ever Vermont town meeting in 4 places at once this Sunday." Robert Reich, whom Sanders promotes this way, advocates equal opportunity for some to rise in a society based on class inequality. And we'll have a link to an article where I have quotes from Robert Reich explicitly to that effect. Equality for Reich and Sanders most definitely does not mean no rich and no poor. It means some rich and many poor. Thus, Reich can write, and we'll put a link to where he has this column that opens up with the following statement. Reich writes, quote, "Charles and David Koch should not be blamed for having more wealth than the bottom 40% of Americans put together. Nor should they be condemned for their petrochemical empire. As far as I know, they've played by the rules and obeyed the laws." End quote. Of course, the politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and pundits like Bob Reich never express any problem with the laws that the people like Koch obeyed. And that's of course the reason why the plutocracy promotes and loves these people. Let us not forget, the billionaires who control the United States were never elected, and they cannot, therefore, be unelected. We need a revolution to remove them from power. PDRBoston.org is about building an egalitarian revolutionary movement. You can chip in and help too. Thank you very much.